Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us from Santa Barbara, California. I'm David Selberg, CEO at Hospice of Santa Barbara. Last year, our Illuminate Speaker Series reached close to 10,000 viewers from some 46 states and 58 countries. Tonight, we have hundreds of folks that have registered for our speaker, and we're excited to have them with us from across the US as well as internationally. A very special thank you to the Santa Barbara Foundation, Robin and Roger Hemovitz, the Natalie Orfila Foundation for their generous sponsorship of the entire Illuminate Speakers series in 2022. Now I have the pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend at Hospice of Santa Barbara, Charles Caldwell. Charles?
Hi, David. It's so good to be here tonight, and so excited to hear what Richard has to share with us. It's also nice just that we're taking a turn and kind of offering, as we like to do, different perspectives on some of the issues that are confronting all of us. And lastly, I just wanted to share that we created this whole Illuminate Speaker Series as a reflection of the needs that we were hearing from our community and people over time around the country as well. And we created this as just a free service because people really were struggling and needing a lot of support, as we all do as we kind of move through this long journey. And it's only made possible through the support of our audience members and people like you. So if you'd like to help ensure that the series continues on, please consider making a gift today. And that would really help us as we continue to have wonderful speakers like Richard. So that's it for me. And David, back to you.
Thank you so much, Charles. And now I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our featured Illuminate speaker, Richard Louv. Richard Louv is a journalist and author of 10 books, including Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, The Nature Principle, Reconnecting with Life in a Virtual Age, and Vitamin N, The Essential Guide to a Nature-Rich Life, 500 Ways to Enrich Your Family's Health and Happiness. His books have been translated and published in 24 countries and help launch an international movement to connect children, families, and communities to nature. He appears frequently on national television and radio programs, including The Today Show, CBS Evening News, and NPR's Fresh Air. As a journalist and commentator, Louv has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times of London, Orion, and Outside, and various other newspapers and magazines. So without further ado, we're excited to welcome Richard Louv to our Illuminate Speakers series. Richard, welcome.
Well, thank you. And it's an honor to be here, and I appreciate being asked. During COVID, a lot of people rediscovered nature. The Los Angeles Times asked me to write a piece at the very beginning, actually a few months into the pandemic. And I had already begun receiving emails and letters from people who, under lockdown, had looked out their window and seen birds for the first time. Now, obviously, they'd seen birds before, but now they really noticed those birds. A mother wrote me and said that there was an owl in their yard in a tree, and that she and her son had developed a relationship with that owl. What was significant about all of these emails that said basically the same thing, and then significant later about the trailheads crowding up. Lots of people wanted to take hikes. when it started to loosen, there's been an overload in the national parks now and many other parks because people intuitively, instinctively knew that they needed the natural world. As to why, in Our Wild Calling, the most recent book, which is about our relationship with other animals, I talk about the loneliness epidemic that medical folks have been talking for some time about a pandemic of its own of human isolation. And human loneliness, as it turns out, is associated with many of the same diseases that are associated with obesity and with smoking. This loneliness is growing, and the reasons for it are often in exact parallel to the reasons for what I've called nature deficit disorder, particularly in children, why children aren't going outside as much. Fear of strangers, fear of traffic, the devaluing in some ways of nature in education, at least up until recently. Our sense of isolation in terms of how our cities are designed. As parents, we get chastised because we're in front of the TV too. We're watching the computer. It's not only our kids. And we're told, go for a walk, take your kids for a walk. In the neighborhood I previously lived in, walk where? In just a few minutes, you would run into a freeway on-ramp. So our cities have not been, for the most part, designed for walking. Now, Santa Barbara obviously is different from most cities. There's a long list of these overuse of electronics, for instance. All of these things, Facebook, all of these things are driving people into this epidemic of loneliness. When I wrote about that, I added another element that I speculate on, which is species loneliness. I think this predates the pandemic. In fact, it predates the research on the impact of loneliness. I think that we have species loneliness. As a species, we're desperate to know that we're not the only ones in the universe. Obviously, that has religious implications. But the irony is that there is a vast conversation going on all around us that we can hear and we can participate in if we notice it. The more that science has learned about how animals, including wild animals in particular, communicate among themselves within species, but also across species. And the more they learn how trees communicate through the fungus that connects them under the ground, under the surface of the ground, in marvelous, incredible ways. We don't give our fellow residents on the earth enough credit. So when people looked out the window and saw birds, they did not feel so alone. And I think that this is fundamental to this hunger for the natural world that we've seen growing. When I wrote Last Child in the Woods, which is specifically about children, that's the first of the 4 books about nature deficit disorder, I could only find about 60 studies that looked into not only the separation of children from nature, but the benefits to health, to nature. I could only find about 60 studies. That was in 2005. One of the things that's improved is now it's kind of a growth industry to study the impact of nature experience on health, cognition, on, in fact, the health of communities, not only the health of individuals. And now if you go to the Children in Nature Network, which is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods, you'll see that we've built a research library, and it's the largest one, and it's free, that you can go to in the world and read about 1,000 studies now, over 1,000 studies. So it's grown tremendously, and most of these are abstracts written of the studies, because so many of them, unfortunately, are behind firewalls. Sometimes these studies are funded by government or by public universities, but they end up behind firewalls, and I kind of think they ought to be available to the public that paid for them. So we've had independent academics write summaries of these studies, and you can search this database and learn more. We know that time in nature reduces the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. Those were some of the first studies that were done, and I reported on those in Last Child. Just a walk through urban trees in an urban park, and children who are observed who have what is called attention deficit disorder, although that has become something of a grab bag for all kinds of symptoms. They've watched those symptoms decrease. Nature improves our blood pressure. It improves our mental health. It improves so much. In 2018, a study by the UK, in the UK, looked at 290 million people around the world from ages from 20 onward. Their analysis of what they found in terms of the relationship between people and nature verified what these over 1,000 studies were showing, that this is fundamental to our human health. This is fundamental to who we are. In addition, the survey indicated that green space exposure reduces the risk of preterm birth, premature death, and high blood pressure, all of which disproportionately affect people of color. So this is literally a matter of life and death. The movement that has emerged is remarkable. I fantasized about a movement at the end of Last Child in the Woods to reconnect kids to nature and families and communities. It was wishful thinking at the time. But pretty soon people started saying, what can I do? And they began to create regional campaigns, bringing business and conservatives and liberals and people who spoke different languages to the same table. These are people who perhaps politically didn't want to be in the same room. And they began to launch campaigns and programs in their urban regions, particularly urban regions. That happened all over the country and it continues to happen. This is happening in other countries as well. The connection to health, in 2010, I was asked to give the keynote to the American Academy of Pediatrics. The reason I'm smiling is because my wife is a nurse practitioner. And before I flew up to talk to several thousand pediatricians, I was thinking, nature deficit disorder, really? And so I was nervous, and my wife noticed that, and she took my face in her hands and said, listen to me, Rich, pediatricians are different from other doctors. They're really nice. So I led with that. Now, obviously, all doctors are really nice. But I didn't expect the reaction. I was careful to say, as I always do, that what I call nature deficit disorder is not a medical diagnosis. It is, though, a way to talk about what so many of us have felt was happening at greater and greater speed all over the world. And we didn't have a way to talk about it. That's what I found when I was doing interviews in the late 80s for another book. is that people felt this, even kids felt this. One little boy in the late 80s in a class told me the reason he played outdoors is because the reason he played indoors is because that's where all the electrical outlets are. We knew this was happening, but we didn't have a way to talk about it. And I think the phrase nature deficit disorder has been helpful in that. I mean that as the nature deficit disorder as the price we pay, our society pays, our cities pay, our schools pay, and our children and we pay throughout our lives, including when we get older. When we do not receive the benefits, the great benefits that now are documented, that nature connection provides. The movement that has grown has not only produced a great number of studies, but after I spoke at the American Academy of Pediatrics, many of those pediatricians went back home and started literally writing prescriptions for nature. And one doctor, Dr. Robert Czar from Washington, D.C., went home and he began to write prescriptions. But then he organized many of the other pediatricians in Washington, D.C. to do the same thing. And they didn't stop there. They created a database of all of the parks and open spaces in Washington, D.C., so that the doctor could not only, talking to the family, write that prescription and talk to them about the benefits of nature, but he could turn, or she could turn to the computer and say, there's a park 3.5 blocks from your house, and here's what you can get there. Biophilic architects now are in demand. You can't pick up an architectural or housing magazine or Home Beautiful magazine or any of those magazines now without reading something about biophilic architecture. That term was not widely known a few years ago. E.O. Wilson, the great scientist and entomologist at Harvard, he did not invent the word biophilia, but he came up with the biophilia hypothesis, which holds that human beings are hardwired, genetically hardwired, to need the rest of nature, to need an affiliation with the rest of nature. And yes, we're nature too. And he said that when we don't get that, we don't do so well. That was the hypothesis. Much of the research that has happened now was inspired by that idea. Architects have been inspired. Biophilic architects who weave nature into the building or the structure that they're designing, and then keep it there. Find that in workplaces, for instance, designed with biophilic architecture and biophilic design within the building, nature all around, even in very urban places, maybe specifically, especially in very urban places. When we design to have more nature around us, in the workplace, the biophilic architecture produces higher productivity, lower rates of burnout, lower rates of absenteeism. It's being used in some schools also to change the nature of schools. It wasn't that many years ago that school architects in California, where I'm at, school architects happened to be often some of the same architects who worked on prisons. And there was this theory in the 70s, some of you maybe remember this, that you should take the windows out of classrooms because it was distracting. And I talked to some of the architects that did that, and they said, well, there's windows. See that vision strip up at the top of the wall? And it was a window that was horizontal, very, very narrow, and you couldn't see out of it, except a few clouds now and then. That theory is out the window now, and now schools increasingly are trying to get their kids outdoors. This really increased during the pandemic when suddenly people realized the multiple values of outdoor classrooms because of social distancing. It's not a new idea. In the tuberculosis epidemic of 1915, there are photographs of high-rise buildings in New York, and you can see classes of kids on top of the high-rises outside. And we've seen that again and again. And again, that was for social distancing also. But the research now shows that cognitive functioning increases greatly, not for all kids, but perhaps for most kids. And some kids, it really makes a huge difference. Over the last 16 years, I've been giving a lot of sermonettes around the country and in other countries that have launched their own campaigns. And I can't tell you how many times teachers have come up to me and said, almost with the same words, that the troublemaker in my class, when I get the class outdoors into nature, the troublemaker becomes the leader, not just better behaved, the leader. It's made me think recently, and again, I hear that again and again. And I know the word troublemaker may be the wrong word to use formally, but let me tell you, the teachers use that word when they talk to me about this. It's made me think about those kids at the back of the class, often wearing black and kind of sullen. It's made me wonder how many leaders we're losing. I actually believe that the future belongs to the nature smart, to people who understand the importance of nature, not only in our personal lives, but in the design of cities, the design of workplaces, the design of schools, in how we deal with illness, in how we house people when they get old and have to have some help. There is some movement in that arena as well. I think we have to think in terms of the habitat of the heart, not only the physical habitat, the natural habitat that we spend so much time and effort and money, as we should, to protect, to preserve, to teach our children about. But then there's this other habitat, the habitat of the heart, and that's our personal our personal connection with the rest of nature. Young kids kind of do that on their own, and then the society talks them out of it over time. The thing is, if one of those habitats goes, I believe so does the other one, that these are linked. And so we have to begin to not only attend to the physical natural habitat, but also to the habitat of the heart. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Richard. Really appreciate your sharing. I know so many parents with young children that are so keenly interested in the work you do and what you've written and talk about. So thank you. Now I have the pleasure to introduce some members of our panel this evening that represent some of the best of our Santa Barbara community. They are Adriana Morrow-Quinn and Devin Azam. Adriana Morrow-Quinn oversees Hospice of Santa Barbara's initiatives, which include compassionate care of Carpinteria and Mi Vida Mi Voz. Adriana thrives in cultivating relationships and educating for an enhanced delivery of services for all members of our community. Excuse me. Devin Assam serves on the board of directors of Wilderness Youth Project. Most recently, Devin has taken on the role of regional director of the California Global Education Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is beginning Her journey as a doctoral student, where she intends to knit together the ideas and experiences she has gathered along her career path in regards to early childhood, nature connection, and school environments. So, Adriana, I'll pass it over to you to begin our panel conversation with Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And Richard, thank you. I wrote down almost a page of notes and a ton of questions. And, I appreciated you taking us back to the pandemic. I think I reflected a little bit on my own journey in the pandemic, where I did find myself working 10 plus days in front of my computer and losing sight of nature. And almost in the middle, when I hit burnout, I remember picking up my running hobby. I went back out to the bluffs. We're fortunate in Santa Barbara. We have a ton of beautiful trailheads, and I picked up something that I hadn't done in years. So thank you for that reminder. I think one of the other things that I picked up was the bringing in of plants into my home. I already had a ton of plants. It was something that I enjoyed, but during the pandemic, I think it truly heightened the want or the need. And I saw around me so much of that. There was podcasts being made, there was YouTube, there was a whole community that came up around just plants in your home. And it's kind of wild to know that's something that's always been around, I think, in our just human traditions, but that it was heightened. So I wonder, my question to you is, what else can we be doing to bring in this nature, not just for children? You touched a little bit upon open spaces and the design of our cities, but how can we continue to bring in that nature, especially as we age, especially as we lose mobility? What can we do to reap the benefits of nature that you speak about?
Well, Adrienne, as you and Devin know, because we talked before, last week my wife and I spent 7 days and 7 nights at an assisted living facility because we had a good friend who was dying. I had immense respect for the hospice nurses that came. I don't know where you get these people, but they are saints, and they're wonderful. There was no nature at all in that facility. It was a house. It was a suburban house, but the backyard was blocked off and cemented over. There were no plants in the building. There were no therapy animals. Now that's not true of many places at this point in terms of assisted living. Animal therapy is really coming into its being seen as much more important now, as well as the biophilic elements that I mentioned. But earlier, for kids and for families, I got so much email from families telling me what they did to connect to nature that I wrote, and it's behind me, Vitamin N, which is the kind of book I don't like to read. It's 500 things that families and communities can do to increase the connection in the natural world. So in some ways, I don't know where to start because there's 500 of them, but some of the most important ones, I think, are put it on the calendar. If we can put soccer on the calendar, we can put nature adventures on the calendar. We can really think about risk in a different way. Obviously, we don't want our kids to hurt themselves. We don't want to be hurt. And YouTube is filled with, not filled, but there are a lot of YouTube videos of bears and mountain lions chasing people. That is so rare that even though I have mountain lions outside my window, my wife and I moved to the mountains outside of San Diego, and I catch them on my webcams at night. So you have to view nature as an antidote to your stress and to your fear about the kids. there was a child psychologist who spoke at one of the Children in Nature Network conferences, and I was really struck by what he said. He said the number one reason for kids breaking bones is that they don't have the upper body strength to hold on to a limb of a tree. They've not developed that. And his approach was, don't tear down the tree, build up the kid. You know, build up our resilience, build up our ability, not only as kids, but as adults. And that's one of the things that nature does for us. It's one of the reasons so many people are out there hiking right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Richard. And Devin, I'll give you a chance to jump in there.
All right, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here this evening with Richard and Adriana and the community tonight. I really appreciate the way that Richard shared all of the progress being made around nature connection all over the world and all of the examples happening during the pandemic. I think it's so important for us to hear good news these days and stories of hope and progress. So I appreciate that. And something I've been thinking about lately is those of us that are in the workforce that are going back into our work settings after having that time away, maybe having more opportunities to connect with nature and finding ourselves in possibly, increased stressful environment where maybe there's catching up to do for, the time that was lost during the pandemic, especially in the field of education. And imagine there's similar stress levels in the healthcare sector. And just thinking about possibly what practices could be brought into the professional setting or a workplace, possibly at staff meetings or when employees gather to help reconnect and ground the culture of the workforce.
Well, Devin, you've probably heard of walking meetings where the staff exits the building and goes on a walk together and discusses whatever they would have discussed in that closed room. Workplaces that acknowledge the impact of nature, I think, are more productive, and the science has shown that. Not all workplaces, but very often that's true. It's going to be very interesting to see as people are going back into the office, but not all of them. Distance work has caught on. A lot of people don't want to go back to that kind of closed environment. A lot of them have moved to rural areas to get out of the big cities. And I want to add here that when I say that, cities have nature too. The Sierra Club a few years ago would come into an inner city neighborhood and give the kids backpacks and lead them on a hike through their neighborhood looking for nature. And they'd always find it. Sometimes in the alleys, sometimes in the cracks of the sidewalk, they'd find insects that were really interesting, and birds, of course, are everywhere. So I think the recognition of the need for some relief for the closed existence that we have been leading, I think is widespread. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to workplaces. There are going to be a lot more people doing distance work than there have been. And by the way, I want to add, adults are very much a part of this. I often say to parents, this is not another item, another bullet point to put on that list of things you should do on your refrigerator. Connecting to nature with your kids in particular, or just connecting to nature on your own, is a stress reducer. That list is a stress producer. So we need to see it as being different somehow from all those other shoulds. And in schools, for instance, one of the things that's been found, a Canadian study, was that teachers who get their kids outdoors to learn and bring nature into the school as well, they burn out at a far less rate than teachers who don't get that opportunity. So teachers need to get out of that cubicle as well.
And if I may, I think in that idea, I think there's this topic of climate change, right? And I see a question just on the chat. It says, you speak of echnophobia, or the fear of the planet, in The Last Child. And I wonder how we can teach children about issues like climate change and extinction without overwhelming them. It's crucial that they learn about these issues, of course, but they are future stewards of our Earth. What would you say to that?
It's really important. And one of the reasons my wife and I moved out here, she's the decider, I'm not. I second guess everything except who I married. And but she's the one that finally got us to move to a small town in the mountains of Southern California. We needed nature too, and we had it where we were at, but we needed intense nature. One of the things that I found, which I'm surprised about, is that there isn't any escape. The fact of climate change and the damage it's doing to nature and to the species is, I feel, deeper up here than I did when we lived in the suburbs of San Diego. I've been thinking lately about kind of the new transcendentalism, perhaps we could call it. You know, Thoreau and Emerson. I think that Thoreau, when he went to Walden Pond, actually thought he was going to escape, and did escape for a while, the industrialization of America. There's nowhere to escape now with climate change and with biodiversity collapse. So there's this ongoing pain that adults feel and children do too. It's part of the reason the rate of depression and suicide among teenagers has been going up. How do we love something that seems to be diminished all around us? How do I love the oak trees the black oaks outside my window, when all I have to do is drive a little ways and I see dead oaks everywhere because of climate change? I think we have to find a different kind of hope and a different kind of imagination. That last thing is very important. So often when we think about the future, and I found this again and again when I've given my sermonettes and I've asked audiences this, what images come into your mind when you think about the far future? Almost always the images that are described look a lot like Blade Runner or Mad Max. And this precedes by many, many years the pandemic period and the current crisis, or the current recognition of the crisis of climate change. That's become our default, that the future is Blade Runner, the future is Mad Max. At best, the future is the Hunger Games. At least there's a few trees in the Hunger Games. What happens to a culture, particularly the children, when they can no longer see images in their mind of a beautiful, nature-rich future? What happens to that culture? Martin Luther King said that we needed to paint a picture of the future. I think schools and parents, even though it is particularly hard now, need to start and continue to imagine a different future. You can find a lot of good news. You can find ways that cities are adapting. You can find ways that, my wife and I just put solar panels on our house. We have a half electric car. And there's a lot of good news out there. And if we can begin to look at the future in classrooms, for instance, and paint it, sometimes literally, paint pictures of it, draw it, describe it. What kind of future would you like to move to? And when you can begin to describe that, people get excited and they say, I'd like to live there. I'd like to go to that future. That step of what I call imaginative hope is essential. You don't go from 0 to 60. You don't go from, you don't start inventing the future immediately. You have to first imagine it. And we need those new and beautiful images of the future we want to go to. And that's particularly true of kids. And I think that if we had more of an organized way of doing that through the schools, through youth organizations, particularly outdoor ones, that would relieve a great deal of the pressure and stress and depression that young people find themselves experiencing.
I hear you talking a lot about the need for imagination, and I'm just wondering if maybe you could speak to the role nature can play in helping, especially young children, foster their imaginations, and even adults and throughout our lifetimes.
One of the studies of outdoor play spaces at schools, you know, when that concrete or asphalt playground has been replaced by a natural setting that has, you know, trees and a place for kids to roll down and logs to jump, to climb, and maybe fall off and learn how to fall. And maybe a garden, a vegetable garden. Many schools are putting those in. On those type of play spaces, in contrast to the typical asphalt or cement playground, kids who are playing in natural play spaces are far more likely to invent their own games, to imagine a game they might play. Not just the games that the adults have spoon-fed them, but their own games. That's far more likely to have. And that has everything to do with executive function, with the ability to be your own boss. I think this issue has something to do with the future of the economy too. If we want a lot of inventive entrepreneurs, having every playground be a natural play space would be one thing we could do to get there. But there was something else about this study of natural play spaces. The kids playing in natural play spaces compared to the kids playing in a typical cement or asphalt playground. The kids playing in the natural play spaces are far more likely to invite kids who don't look like them, who are not the same race, not the same culture, not the same gender, to play with them. So this has a socializing impact too. You know, the racial divisions that we're experiencing now, some of the same principles need to be applied to that. I think imaginative hope is one of those principles, you know. And the kids who invite other kids to play with them who don't look like them are exercising their imagination.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that term, imaginative hope. That's going to be a keeper for me.
That was a great question, Devin. And to add to that, you know, as you were talking about biophilic architecture, I immediately transported myself to a previous travel. I was in Shanghai and I saw buildings there, skyscrapers that had gardens growing out of the roofs. And just for me at that time, it predated the pandemic, was such an eye-opening experience. It was the first time that I had seen these buildings in the center of a metropolis area. And so coming back home, it feels like we're not necessarily there yet. What can we as a country perhaps do to get to that place? And how do we engage folks in this movement of nature for all of the benefits that you're talking about?
By the way, Singapore has a lot of biophilic architecture in it now. It's around the world. You can find it if you look for it. You can find it in American cities if you look for it too. But you're right, we're not exactly on the cutting edge of that yet, but I think we could be. The Children in Nature Network, which I mentioned earlier, which is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods, has a partnership now with the National League of Cities. The National League of Cities it represents about 18,000 mayors. There's about 18,000 mayors and other city leaders who belong to it. And we've got, I think it's over a dozen now, cities as target cities where the National League of Cities and Children Nature Network go into the neighborhoods and ask the same question that you did about how do we create that? How do we create nature-rich cities, starting with your neighborhood? And the ideas that come out of there are great. You know, we don't have to wait for the big investors. We can start with community gardens and with changing our houses. We can start with our backyards. There's a guy, Paul Dayton, who has several books out now, and he's a friend. He's a wonderful entomologist and several other types of scientists. He writes about what he calls the homegrown national park. I've been talking about that for about 15 years, more than Paul has, because he's modest and quiet. But he's, to my pleasure, he's starting to talk about it a lot more. And what he means by that is if you replant your yard with native plants that have co-evolved with the butterflies, with the birds of a bioregion, with the mammals of a bioregion, you can help replant biodiversity in the densest of neighborhoods if you do that. My wife and I did that. Actually, I should correct myself. My wife did that. And she decided to do that. And in the house we lived in before, and redid our backyard with native plants. You have to do some research to find what those plants are, because they're very different biosphere to bioregion to bioregion. And sometimes those regions are small. And there are nurseries now that are starting to have special areas of native plants. We did that in our backyard. And all of a sudden we saw critters showing up that we'd never seen. Butterflies, I had no idea there were California native butterflies. I'd not thought about it before, but now they were showing up, little white ones that I'd never seen before. Fence lizards had always been there, but not very many of them. Now our yard was filled with fence lizards. And I would look out the window as I worked, and the fence lizards would be out there doing their push-ups, you know. Led me to believe there's more posturing among fence lizards than there is in the US Congress. They made me laugh, just like they just did. Mm-hmm. The animals around us, the plants around us, are part of what we call our social capital. We don't recognize them as such, but they affect our mood. They affect our connection, our psychological health, our connection to place. But this homegrown national park, what if the person next to us did that? And then the next, and then the next. All through the city, you would begin to have wildlife corridors planted by families, by kids. You don't have to wait for the redesign of the city to do that. And the insects that are attracted to native plants are basic to the food chain that attracts everything else, all those birds and all the animals that come with that. So I think we can do a lot to reverse the biodiversity collapse right in our own backyard.
Thank you. I love that. And just with, as Devin mentioned about the hope, I'm hopeful for the gardens that our students are creating here in Santa Barbara. Devin, would you like to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's such an amazing school garden network here in Santa Barbara. It is really an incredible example of how just an impact it can have. You know, we're able to have, I believe, school gardens at every elementary school site and many of the middle schools, and I believe some high schools in our local districts. And we have a small a nonprofit in town that provides garden educators, so that the students, making sure that students are really interfacing with that garden on a regular basis, not just having the garden be off in the corner. So I think it's a really great example for other communities to be able to look to.
By the way, I just glanced over at the chat, and one of the questions jumped out at me. It says, what does he think about this trend to the metaverse? And this person wrote scary and a frowny face. So, just the other day, I spoke like this at an event that was about the metaverse. I don't know why they invited me. And the people imagining what the metaverse could be. And to those who don't know, and I didn't know until recently, it's a little like living in a video game where you go to work in the office and there's your office mates and they all have avatars that walk around. And it's more complicated than this and it has a lot of possibilities, obviously. But the theme of this was, can the metaverse bring us back to nature? What did we miss in that? It is true that technology can help, and I'm not anti-tech. I believe there's a kind of equation, which is the more high tech our lives become, the more nature we need. We need that balance. So we need even more nature now because of the overflow of technology in our lives. But technology can help. There was a story recently about, remember I talked about that conversation that's going on all around us among animals and plants. There are now efforts to try to record that and decode it so that we can listen more carefully to what the animals are telling us. Some of that I think is pretty interesting. But the metaverse, I'm not sure why I was there.
You had mentioned laughter. I think it was the lizard that made you laugh, and that reminded me that I wanted to bring up play in tonight's discussion and the importance of play for children and adults, and wondered if you could just speak to the role of nature in encouraging play for all of us.
The two things, nature experience and play, are so linked that sometimes they're hard to separate. They're hard to think of differently. Now, that has changed recently because of the influence of video games. And again, I'm not demonizing video games. One of the things I've believed is that the more that adults demonize anything, the more the kids want that thing that they're demonizing. So I'm careful about that. But the constraint on play, the physical constraint on play is remarkable. More and more parents now are keeping their kids indoors. Again, many of the reasons I mentioned earlier, and understandably, sometimes the fear of strangers. Not all neighborhoods are safe. But the kind of play that many of us did when we were growing up, back when we were walking 10 miles to school through the snow, and I know that sounds like an old guy, it was outdoors. We were outdoors all the time. That picture you see right there is me at, I think, 3 or 4, and my dog Banner. He's a collie. I did not at that age, although I did leave the property now and then, even at that age. I spent much of my boyhood in the woods behind our house outside of Raytown, Missouri, the Kansas City area. And my parents often didn't know where I was. But Banner, my dog, always knew where I was. And he would do this thing. He would go home if I was doing something bad. And somehow he knew what was bad. And my mother would look for him. And when she saw Banner, she'd know that I was up to no good. And there's a story I tell in our walk calling about going through the ice and Banner showed up again and all of that. And about learning ethics from Banner, which I believe have been passed down thousands of years from wolves. That's a whole nother story. But play, if it's not outside, it is constrained. That doesn't mean that indoor play isn't great. I had a model railroad when I was a kid. It was great. But I don't remember many of those moments at the model railroad. What I remember is going down to the creek and sitting there and the frogs having all jumped into the creek, into the water, and sitting and waiting for the frogs to come back. Their noses would pop up on the surface of the water. And then think about what it is to be a frog. And to make forts and tree houses, to make something, to use your hands, not just your thumb, not just the mouse, but to use your whole body to make things and to experience. Natural areas are a great place to do that. It's one of the reasons that I think it's so important to hasten the trend toward natural schoolyards at schools.
Thank you, Richard. And I know we're getting close on time here. I would love to continue chatting with you. This has been a fantastic conversation. And so I just wanted to leave room for some closing comments. And I know for me, hearing your conversation and the benefits of children really almost reinforces my love for houseplants. I know in my, there's this word out there, plant mom, in my plant mom journey, kind of learning about a plant and how it resonates with my real life and how plants sometimes thrive in unexpected places. And there's just been so many similarities, if you will, that I can adapt to my personal life to my plants and their natural cycle of living and growing. And so thank you for validating that for me. It was a wonderful night. Devin, I'd like to just give you some time if you have any closing comments before we turn it back over to David.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I just appreciate the time to be talking with you this evening, Richard, and especially appreciate your mention of green schoolyards, which is something that I'm particularly working on right now. And there's a lot of roadblocks. So I just, as a reminder to keep moving in the direction and keep overcoming those roadblocks as they come. So you're giving me a lot of faith to keep going. So I appreciate that so much. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you. And Richard, any last comments on your end?
I'll tell you a short story, an interview I did recently for something I'm working on now. There was a guy that contacted me, and there's a mountain right out our front window, a big mountain called Vulcan Mountain. And this guy's a lawyer in La Jolla. As a kid, his parents would bring him up here for hiking and camping trips. And he bonded to that mountain. He later bought a little bit of land on the other side of the mountain. Fires come through here. We've had several cataclysmic fires that have taken out big sections of forest, including on Vulcan Mountain. This guy had been coming up to the mountain for years and climbing up the mountain and planting trees in the barren areas. He'd bring little pine seedlings and plant them. He didn't tell many people he was doing that. He just did it. And then one day he was sitting in his truck at the bottom of the mountain and began to sob because he suddenly realized what was so obvious. Because of climate change, those aren't the last fires. But that's not the end of the story. That was several years ago. He's been planting trees ever since. He didn't give up. And in a way, I think of that as a metaphor for what we've all got to do is plant, and don't give up.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful closure for our meeting tonight. Thank you. I appreciate your time, and I'll ask David to join us back on screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana Marroquin, Devin Azam, and Richard. Thank you so much for talking with us tonight. It brought back so many memories for me growing up in Santa Barbara, and right down at the end of my street was a creek and fields and hills. And I remember taking my dog Casey down there through my entire childhood. And one day when my mom died, when I was a little kid, I remember it was the place I went to after she died consistently. And so this idea of nature, I was deeply touched, Richard. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you to all of you and to the people who came in. I wish I could have answered all those questions. Some good ones there. Thanks.
So I want to share with all of our watchers this evening, our viewers, that we are so pleased to be able to offer the Illuminate Speaker Series for free, but we couldn't do it without your help. So please consider a donation to help ensure the future of this series. Also, please visit our website to sign up for our upcoming Illuminate events. Again, these are free, they're open to everyone, but pre-registration is required. Our next speakers are Jack Cornfield and Trudy Goodman on Thursday, November 17th, as they present What Would Love Have Me Do Today? Jack Cornfield, is the co-founder and senior teacher of Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Northern California. And Trudy Goodman is founder and guiding teacher of Insight LA in Los Angeles. Jack and Trudy will offer and explore the resources of grounding, the gifts of common humanity, the power of mindful, loving awareness, the opening of vast and tender perspectives, and the great heart of compassion that is found from within. So more information can be found here in our chat feature or on our website in the coming days at Hospice of Santa Barbara. So I just want to thank all of you for participating and listening and being with us tonight, and have a good rest of your week. Bye-bye.